Pause for a moment. Were you aware that more than 90% of viewers like you have yet to tap the subscribe button? If you're enjoying this content, consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support us in delivering more captivating cheating stories each day. We'd also appreciate knowing where you're tuning in from, so drop your city in the comments to show us how far our stories are reaching. Your encouragement fuels us to keep creating. Let's now resume the video. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah, and sharing this tale feels deeply personal. It's a topic I've never broached with anyone close to me, but articulating it might help me process everything. Before delving into it, remember to subscribe as I'll be revealing another intriguing story tomorrow just for you. Last summer, my cousin and his wife requested me to care for their son, Ethan, over the weekend while they took a brief trip. Ethan, a bright and considerate 19-year-old, was always a pleasure to be around. I accepted without hesitation, assuming it would be a typical weekend filled with movies, snacks, and casual conversation. The first day passed without any notable events. We spent our time watching a comedy series, sharing laughs over silly jokes, and catching up on life. Everything felt perfectly ordinary, but little did I know that the next day would bring unexpected change. On that quiet morning, Ethan mentioned he was off to meet some friends. Relishing the chance for some solitude, I made a cup of tea and settled by the window, savoring the tranquility. Leisurely scrolling through my phone, I then decided to watch a show to lift my spirits. The thought never crossed my mind that Ethan might return sooner than anticipated. Suddenly, the front door swung open, and I turned to find Ethan standing there, a look of surprise in his eyes. I forgot my keys. He quickly explained, though there was an unspoken tension in his expression. In that brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Flustered, I hurriedly tried to compose myself. He wished I could vanish. Murmuring that he should knock, my voice quivering. His gaze shifted uncomfortably as he took a step back, muttering an apology before exiting the room. The remaining hours of the day passed in a strained silence. Ethan avoided eye contact, creating an unfamiliar tension in the atmosphere. Sitting in the living room later that evening, I felt compelled to address the situation. Ethan, I began cautiously about earlier. Let's just pretend it didn't happen, okay? He quickly nodded in agreement, but there was something in his expression that hinted at unresolved feelings. Despite my attempt to move past it, the unease persisted. Gradually, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior over the following day. He seemed to find excuses to be in my presence more frequently, his gazes lingering longer than usual, and the air between us seemed charged with unspoken emotions. One evening, while I was cleaning up after dinner, Ethan approached me with a hint of hesitation in his voice. "Sarah, can we talk?" I turned to face him, drying my hands on a towel, and replied, "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Mine, I can't stop thinking about what happened," he admitted, his face flushing red. "It was an accident," I said quickly, trying to dismiss it. "There's no reason to dwell on it." "It's not just that," he said, taking a step closer. "I feel different when I'm around you, like I can talk to you about anything." His words took me by surprise. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent, waiting for him to say more. "You're someone I trust," he continued, "and I think I might feel something more than that." His confession left me speechless. Ethan was my cousin, and the thought of anything beyond family ties was unthinkable. But as he stood there, vulnerable and sincere, I couldn't deny the emotional pull between us. It wasn't right, and yet I couldn't ignore it. "Ethan," I said softly, "this can't happen. We're family." "I know," he replied, his voice cracking, "but I've never felt this way before." I placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding myself. "We have to set boundaries. Whatever you're feeling, it's not something we can." In a show of rebellion against our conversation, the tension lingered, refusing to dissipate completely. Ethan's mere presence served as a constant reminder of emotions I wasn't prepared to confront. Despite my efforts to push these feelings aside, everything seemed altered now. Concurrently, my marriage was unraveling. Daniel, my husband, was consumed by work, leaving our interactions frigid and distant. The emotional chasm in my marriage exacerbated the confusion I felt in my connection with Ethan. One evening, a message from him appeared. "Can I come over? I need to talk." I paused before responding, conveying, "Ethan, not tonight. It's complicated." Swiftly he replied, "Please, I just need to talk." "I promise I won't cross any boundaries." Against my instincts, I acquiesced. Upon his arrival, he stood at the doorstep, his expression torn. "I don't want to add to your troubles," he said, "but I cannot deny my feelings." I let out a resigned sigh, stepping aside. "Ethan, we've been through this." "I understand," he responded, frustration threading through his words. "But you deserve happiness, and I can see that you." The impact of his words was like being struck by a brick. Indeed, he was not mistaken. My marriage had evolved into a monotonous routine, and Ethan had unknowingly filled a void within me. Yet acknowledging this felt like a perilous step that I couldn't retract. "This isn't a matter of what I deserve," I asserted firmly, "but of doing what is right." Ethan acknowledged my words with a somber expression. "I simply needed you to understand my sentiments." Following that evening, I made a resolution. It became imperative for me to concentrate on rekindling my marriage. Daniel and I arranged a trip to reconnect, but the gap between us seemed insurmountable. Every conversation effort yielded little result, and despite my efforts, thoughts of Ethan persisted more than I cared to admit. Upon our return, I recognized the need for change. I could not continue existing in an emotional limbo, torn between my commitments and concealed emotions. Ethan and I managed to find a way to sustain our connection without overstepping any boundaries. The bond between us persisted, yet we were aware of the necessary boundaries. It was challenging, but ultimately it was necessary. Instead of seeking emotional fulfillment in someone else, I turned inward. I focused on rebuilding my own happiness. Whether or not my marriage survived, I had to find peace within myself first. This story highlights the emotional struggles many people face in relationships where they feel unseen or unfulfilled. When there's an emotional void, it's easy to seek comfort in the wrong places. But true fulfillment comes from self-awareness and honesty, first with yourself, then with those around you. After returning from the trip with Daniel, I tried to convince myself that things could go back to normal. I focused on my routine work, household chores, and making an effort in my marriage. But something inside me had shifted. Every shared moment with Daniel felt forced, and every silence between us grew heavier. Ethan, on the other hand, remained a lingering presence in my thoughts. He didn't message as often as before, but when he did, I could sense the restraint in his words. He was trying to move on, I thought to myself, realizing I needed to do the same. While preparing dinner one evening, Daniel entered the kitchen, his expression inscrutable. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than usual, "are you happy?" My hand trembled, the knife hovering above the vegetables. This wasn't what I had expected him to say. "What do you mean?" I asked, avoiding his gaze. Leaning against the counter, his demeanor distant, he said, "You've been different. Like you're here, but not really here." Swallowing hard, I replied, "I've just been stressed." "Is it about us?" He inquired cautiously. I wanted to deny it, to pretend everything was fine, but for the first time in years, I felt the urge to be honest. "Yes," I admitted, barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I know I haven't been the best husband. I get caught up in work and I guess I assumed you were okay with it." "I wasn't," I said firmly. "I felt alone for a long time, Daniel, and I don't know if we can fix that." He nodded, taking in my words. "Do you want to fix it?" I hesitated. He pondered the true question at hand. Did I still have the will to give it a try? The day after, standing at a crossroads, Ethan reached out to me with a text. "I hope you're okay. Just checking in." Reading his words, a pang of sadness gripped my chest. While part of me yearned to pour out my thoughts to him instantly, I knew it wouldn't be fair to either of us. So I restrained myself and took the time to contemplate my desires, not just in relation to Ethan or Daniel, but also within my own being. It was then that I made the decision to seek therapy. Initially awkward, confiding in a stranger gradually revealed the layers of emotion that I had kept bottled up inside. Resentment towards Daniel, uncertainty about Ethan, and a deep-rooted fear of solitude. As the therapy sessions unfolded, it became clear to me how these issues had been festering unaddressed for years. One evening, following a particularly intense therapy session, I unexpectedly found myself standing outside Ethan's apartment. Even though I hadn't planned to go there, my feet carried me there nonetheless. I mustered the courage to knock on the door, and when Ethan opened it, surprise flickered across his eyes. "Sarah, can we talk?" I asked. Without a word, he stepped aside, granting me entry. The ambience of the apartment was compact yet orderly, showcasing traces of his existence. Books arranged on the table, a lone cup of coffee, a jacket casually hung over the couch. "Are you all right?" he inquired, worry evident in his tone. Taking a seat, I intertwined my fingers, pondering my response. "I'm not sure," I replied, meeting his gaze. "About you, about Daniel, about myself." Ethan gave a subtle nod, his countenance inscrutable. And I came to the realization that I was seeking something. A solution to the void I sensed within my marriage. "And you made me feel acknowledged in a way I hadn't experienced in years." His jaw clenched as he averted his gaze. "I never intended to complicate things for you. I understand," I uttered softly, "but the reality is, regardless of my sentiments towards you, it was never about us. It was about my attempt to evade my own misery." Ethan peered back at me, his eyes probing mine. "So, what now?" I exhaled wearily. "I need to discern my identity without relying on others to complete me. This entails dedicating time to myself and relinquishing you." After a moment of silence, he nodded, expressing his understanding. The weight of the silence lingered between us, yet it no longer felt unbearable, but rather necessary. The following months were challenging as Daniel and I engaged in difficult conversations, some resulting in tears and others in quiet contemplation. Ultimately, we reached a mutual decision to part ways, not out of hostility, but through a shared comprehension. Gradually, communication with Ethan dwindled. Though initially painful, these emotions eventually subsided. I turned inward, dedicating time to self-improvement by traveling, exploring new hobbies, and finding solace in my own company. It was the first time in years that I felt liberated. Looking back, I realized that Ethan was not my destined path, but rather a mirror of what I had been seeking. True happiness, I discovered, must originate from within. Oftentimes, we confuse emotional connections with destiny, seeking completion in others rather than focusing on our individual wholeness. If you resonated with this story and desire more thought-provoking narratives, remember to subscribe. Thank you for your support. We will see you in the upcoming video.